Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by air and naval forces of the Empire of Japan. Those words probably are better known than most of the words in American history, except maybe when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. But today, we're going to cover the story of Japan strikes at dawn, the defeats at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Singapore. Was it a conspiracy or was it a follow? I thought that in this unfortunate age of conspiracies, it would be interesting for all of you to have the latest research on the origins of World War II in the Pacific. Well, first of all, let's take a look at the beginning and what caused the war to start in the Pacific at that time. In 1852, Admiral Perry, with a U.S. fleet, first visited Japan. The reason why for this was that before then, Japan was a closed medieval society. And if merchant ships from America or England or wherever washed up on the shores of Japan, the crews were killed by the Japanese, and the Japanese refused to trade. Well, we forced the Japanese to open up trade with the West. After that, after particularly the Civil War ended, the Meiji period of westernization of Japan began, where Japan began to industrialize, and they invited the British to help them form a modern navy, and the Germans to help them form a modern army. In 1904, the Japanese fought the Russians and annihilated their entire Pacific fleet at Port Arthur. They also annexed Korea as a colony. China was weak and divided, and they looked at China as a potential source of industrial capacity and also a better trading source for the Japanese. Okay, all right, very good, thank you. And they annexed Korea in 1910. Now, China was very weak and divided. Those of you that saw the movie The Last Emperor, very popular movie at one time, saw the child emperor who was overthrown, and a democratic government was formed in China that was very weak. It was a period of warlords, civil wars, etc. So in 1931, at the Marco Polo Bridge, Japan caused an incident and invaded China. They also created a puppet government in Manchukuo and put that last Chinese child emperor, who is now an adult, as the new emperor of Manchukuo. As a sidelight, during that time period, the Japanese built in Manchuria a huge weapons of mass destruction factory with anthrax and other poisonous chemicals. In fact, they produced so much they could have killed everyone on Earth. And they experimented on prisoners of war, Chinese and Koreans, those weapons of mass destruction. So this war starts, but China was already in the middle of a civil war between the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek and the communists of Mao Zedong. So you can imagine the complete chaos. Now, for a time, the nationalists and communists formed an alliance to fight the Japanese. The Imperial Army of Japan assured Emperor Hirohito of Japan that there would be a very short war. Instead, the bulk of the Japanese army from that point until 1945 was fighting in China. the bulk of the Japanese army was fighting in China. Now, at the same time, because the Japanese were interested in forming an empire, there was tremendous conflict between the civilian government of Japan and the military regime in Japan, particularly during the 30s. During the 20s and 30s, the military assassinated many of the ministers of the Japanese government. At the same time, the Army and Navy was divided. Of course, remember, the Army had been trained by the Germans, the Navy by the British. So now they were divided between two policies, strike north or strike south. The strike south was supported by the Navy because they believed they could conquer the Indo-Chinese in the south here. They could conquer these. Oh, it's not working now. Oops. Well, the islands in the south of Indonesia, which had tin, rubber. The Army wanted to invade Siberia, and there they thought they could defeat the Russians as they had done earlier. So there were two rivalries going on at that time. In August of 1937, the Japanese fought a battle, as you see on this map, in Outer Mongolia with the Russian army. They suffered a humiliating defeat. Actually, they suffered 61,000 casualties. And the man who defeated him was a man that would make big headlines that we talked about last month when we talked about the German-Russia war. It was Marshal Zhukov. He was in command of the Russian army in Asia at that time. He would be the one in the end that would win at Stalingrad. He would be the one that would drive to Germany and win the Battle of Berlin at the end of World War II in Europe. Now, among the prisoners that were taken was this young man, Yang. He was 19 years old. He had been forcibly conscripted into the Japanese army. He was Korean. He was captured by the Russians and sent to a Russian slave labor camp, mining in Siberia, or, well, they were dying. They were starving to death, they were freezing to death, etc. During 1943, Germany had invaded Russia, and they needed more manpower. So they offered them a deal. Comrades, fight in the glorious Russian army for Mother Russia, or you can stay here and die. So many of the Koreans signed up and ended up in the Russian army. In 1943, they participated in the Second Battle of Krakow, and they were captured by the German army. He was put into another slave labor camp, now making munitions for the Germans. Again, they were being brutalized, they were starving to death, etc. By 1944, even earlier, the Germans were short of manpower. They came in and they said, fellow people that hate communists, you have a choice. You can join Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht, or you can stay here and starve to death. So many of them joined the German army. In fact, 1 million non-Germans fought in the Wehrmacht and the SS in World War II. He ends up in Normandy in 1944, near Utah Beach, as a support unit. They're captured on D-Day. The paratroopers capture them. They're interviewing this guy, and they say, "You're not a German, who are you?" "No, I'm a Korean." So he ended up fighting in the Japanese army, the Russian army, and the German army. After the war, he moved to Illinois, and that's where he died in the 90s, the 1990s, all right? Very interesting story. There's a crazy movie that the Koreans made entitled My Way. If you want to look it up, I think it's on YouTube, which shows this story, embellished, of course. So, in 1939, Hitler enters this German-Russian non-aggression pact that enables him to what? Invade Poland, and of course the Russians invade half of Poland, and they also gobble up Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia at the same time. The Japanese, of course, were demoralized by this because Russia was their big enemy. So they signed a non-aggression pact in 1941 with the Soviets, which didn't please Hitler, because ultimately, if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler's plan was what? To invade Russia. They needed living space. They moved the German farmers into the Ukraine. They wipe out Poland. They kill all the Slavs. This is Lieberstrom, right? Okay. So now, months before Barbarossa, he's trying to pressure the Japanese to attack Japan on the Eastern Front. They didn't do it, did they? No, because they'd been bloodied already on attacking the Russians. They were going to go south. So this, in a way, nullified, in many ways, the tripartite alliance that Japan had signed with Germany and Italy. Japan was not going to help Hitler with Russia. And there's the tripartite alliance, September 1940. So now Japan occupies French Indochina during 1940-41. Very negative public opinion about Japan's aggressive expansion. Madam Chiang Kai-shek comes to America and pleads for food for the starving children of China. How many of you, when you were children, had to eat all of those vegetables because there were the starving children of China? I see you shaking your head, that's right. Made a very big impression publicly. So what happens? Roosevelt embargoes the oil and tin exports to Japan unless they withdraw from French Indochina. Now remember, the French had been conquered by the Germans in 1940, so now the Japanese are going to occupy French Indochina, and they did. Because of the embargo, the Japanese fleet has only 6 months of oil left before it is out of gas, quite literally. So they began planning an attack on the United States. Here is Tojo. Tojo became the prime minister. They had assassinated other civilians to get him in place, and he formulated the theme of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. With firmness we fight, with kindness we build, fight onward till Asia is Asia's own. So this was anti-Western imperialism. Of course, it was just fostering Japanese imperialism, and other programs I've given that you have attended, you realize the Japanese did not treat kindly the people they conquered, whether it was in China, the Philippines, Indonesia, wherever. They murdered many, many of the indigenous population and enslaved others. Well, on this map, we see the armies attack 5 things at once: Malaysia, Peninsula and Singapore, South China and Hong Kong, Thailand and Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and at the same time neutralized Pearl Harbor. Now, Admiral Yamamoto had been in the United States. He knew Americans. He had seen the industrial capacity of the United States. And he warned them that if you attack the Pacific Fleet, the United States will strike back. It will take time, but they will strike back and crush us. So the interesting thing is Operation Z, which you see now, there's the fleet that started in northern Japan on the 26th of November and sailed to Pearl Harbor. In 1930s, the Japanese Naval Academy had asked its graduates, How would you carry out a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor? That's 1931. Now remember, up to that time, no one had ever used aircraft carriers to launch such a major assault. Also, aircraft had never sunk battleships, and they didn't think it could be done. So, Yamamoto predicted that in the first 6 to 12 months of the war, he would run wild, and they'd have victory after victory after victory. And after that, you can expect no more successes. And he was correct. This map shows the extent of the early Japanese conquest, after which the U.S. began to destroy the Japanese Empire. Now back, you see the combined Japanese naval force, 6 aircraft carriers leaving Japan. They took a northerly route to avoid detection, total radio silence. Here now is the attack that was launched on December 7th of the Pacific Fleet. When I first went to Hawaii, and we flew into Oahu, and I've seen much of the combat footage, including the Japanese footage of the attack. We flew right over Pearl Harbor like the Japanese did in their attack, which I found very interesting. How many of you have been to Pearl Harbor? Okay, very moving experience, where you can go and see the Arizona as a fitting graveyard, a memorial to those men that died there. And then you look to your left, and there is the battleship Missouri, where the war ended. So the war starts here, and the war ends right there. Very historic. And you can go on the Missouri. I had lunch on the Missouri. The deck plate is there for the surrender. 480 carrier planes were on those ships. 360 were deployed for the attack. This is fading in and out for some reason, I'm sorry. Now there were 2 attack waves that reached Hawaii. Pearl Harbor, of course, was very shallow. Yeah, why don't you give that to me, and I'll shut this
Same
off.
channel, yeah, we'll switch it up.
Okay.
I'll turn it on.
Okay. Pearl Harbor was very shallow. But the Japanese were in Italy, and they saw what happened when the British torpedoed the Italian warships sitting in harbor in southern Italy. They had adjusted the torpedoes for shallow water, and they therefore modified their torpedoes for the same attack. Now, the Japanese had planned a second attack on Pearl Harbor. However, at the time of the first attack, they didn't know where the U.S. carrier force was. They were out on maneuvers, thank God. Because if they had been there, they would have been sunk. And it would probably have taken an extra year before we would have ended the war, at least an extra year. Of course, their big mistake was that if they had made the second attack, at the time they would have made it, the carriers would have just been coming back into Pearl Harbor, and they'd have clobbered the carriers, all right? So we're just lucky that they didn't launch that second attack. Well, what happened? 3 battleships sunk, 4 more damaged, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, 3,389 total casualties. December 8th, the U.S. declares war on Japan. December 11th, Hitler declares war on America. Now, the Tripartite Alliance that they signed only stated that if Japan was attacked by someone else, the Germans would come to their aid. But the Japanese had attacked the U.S. Hitler did not have to go to war with the United States at that time. Remember, December 11, 1941, what was going on? His panzers were trying to get to Moscow and were having a hard time. Now, I think ultimately we would have gone to war with Germany, but not necessarily at that time. So this gave the United States the ability to fight a two-front war. Because up until that point, we only would have gone to war with Japan for those few days. And of course, Hitler greatly underestimated the industrial capacity of the United States, and the German military thought, hey, these guys, their army is smaller than Uruguay. What can they do in a short time when we have one of the greatest armies in the world? So, how effective was the Japanese attack? Well, 6 of those 8 battleships were repaired, refloated. One of them was at the Normandy invasion, bombarding the shoreline. The carriers were untouched, the submarines were untouched, and also all the docks and supplies, most of those were untouched. Now, Admiral Nimitz said that the war could have been over, would have lasted 1 or 2 years longer if they had destroyed some of those facilities. Could the Japanese have invaded Hawaii and taken it? The answer is yes, if they didn't also want to invade all those other areas. They were totally committed to all those other attacks at that time. They'd have had to possibly delay the invasion of the Philippines. We had 20,000 soldiers on Hawaiian Islands at that time. But this was a peacetime army. If they had taken Pearl Harbor, it probably, or the Hawaiian Islands, it would have driven the fleet, everything back to San Diego, the West Coast. And it would have taken even longer to ultimately defeat the Japanese. But that was not in their game plan. Their game plan was just to destroy the Pacific Fleet. Now, the Russian spy at the German embassy, who worked for Stalin, had warned that the Japanese planned to attack Pearl Harbor. And as a result of that, Stalin was able to do what? Transfer those divisions from Siberia to Moscow in December of 1941 and stop the Germans from taking Moscow, which was one of the decisive turning points in the Russian-German War. If Hitler had taken Moscow, had taken Leningrad, had taken Stalingrad, ultimately Germany would have still lost, because the Russians had such huge manpower resources, far larger than the Germans ever believed. They could field 400 divisions ultimately. And with their industrial capacity, since they moved so much of their factories beyond the Ural Mountains and Lend-Lease, they had an endless river of tanks, planes, and guns. Okay. All right. Was it a conspiracy? Right. We all know that. The America Firsters knew that Roosevelt was looking for any excuse to get us in the war. I don't care if Roosevelt had said, we'll never send our boys to Europe again. He was looking for a way around it. He was chummy with Churchill. The British were looking for their way to trick us into the war. Look at the Zimmerman telegram in World War I, where the British faked that telegram and the Americans read it and said the Germans would support Mexico if they would invade the Southwest and they could take over California. Oh my God. Tricky people, those Germans, right? So, did Roosevelt know about the attack on Pearl Harbor before it occurred? And he just didn't say anything because he knew that that would start the war. Well, the Japanese had a code. And the Japanese broke the magic code. We broke the magic code of the Japanese. However, there were thousands of Japanese messages that were, at that point, being interpreted. Now, we were on a peacetime footing. We had thousands of messages. There were 2 men translating all of those messages. So many of you have read books about how historians now have gone through all the messages and have conclusively showed that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. Right, but they hadn't translated that message. Ultimately, it came to light, but long after Pearl Harbor. You can remember that for the Battle of Midway, the big victory that we scored there, we figured out, because we had many men and women at that point working on breaking the Japanese code and translating those messages, we did find out that the Japanese were going to launch a major assault in the Central Pacific to try to take Midway and destroy the Navy. Well, Admiral Kimmel was the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. And that fleet had been moved from San Diego to Pearl Harbor to try to intimidate the Japanese that we meant business. Now, Admiral Kimmel failed to send out long-range reconnaissance air patrols. The fleet was left at anchor. And when that attack occurred, if you've seen the movie, Tora, 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 how many of you have seen that movie? All right, a stray bullet went through the window of his office and struck him, but didn't wound him. And what did he say? He said, it would have been better if it had killed me, because he knew that he would be blamed for not being ready for this attack. There's Admiral Kimmel, and there's General Walter Short. And he was in command of the U.S. Army in Hawaii. And he was responsible for the Pearl Harbor defense. And he was concerned about sabotage. So he grouped all these aircraft. Remember, the Army controlled the Air Force at that time. And he clustered them all in tight clusters. And that's why we lost so many aircraft to that attack. So now both of these men were relieved after the attack. And neither Kimmel nor Short were ever clearly exonerated from the colossal defense failure at Pearl Harbor. However, in 1991, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution that exonerated both of them. But President Clinton didn't sign it. That's as close as we've come. So, was there a conspiracy? No. There were politicians who wanted to make hay. America Defense, Lindbergh and others. Certainly the German-American Bund wanted it. Beware of conspiracy theories, ladies and gentlemen. Get your facts straight. What are the source of the facts, or are they half facts or half truths? So many books have been written about this, that the U.S. knew about the attack. Unfortunately, there is no clear evidence that that is the truth. And certainly Kimmel had known that the Japanese had sailed. Nimitz speculated that his battleships could attack and sink Japanese carriers if they came close to Pearl Harbor. But they didn't know, in fact, they thought they would attack the Philippines rather than Hawaii, since Hawaii was so far from Japan. So now let's move on to part 2, the Philippine mess-up. Japan invaded the Philippines shortly after Pearl Harbor. In fact, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Philippines was alerted. And there, of course, here is General MacArthur and Wainwright, his second in command. By the way, Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, he was a colonel then, he had been MacArthur's chief of staff, and they had gotten involved in an argument, and MacArthur basically fired him, so he came back to the United States. MacArthur commanded a combined Philippine defense force of 12,000 Filipinos, and 20,000 US troops. And they were alert on December 8th. Marshall ordered him at that time to attack the Japanese air base on Formosa. And there is Clark Field, the headquarters of the U.S. Far East Air Force. Most of the planes, 91 of them, were obsolete P-40 Warhawk fighters. But 34 were B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. Between 8 and 8:30 in the morning on December 8th, they all took off and flew to Formosa. But Formosa was socked in. They could see nothing. They turned around. They all landed between 10:30 and 11 to refuel. What happened? The Japanese attacked, caught them on the ground, and wiped them out. 12:40. So the Far East Air Force lost 50% of its planes in 45 minutes, and about all the rest were lost over the next few days. Now, despite this devastating attack, what was left of the Air Force stubbornly opposed the Japanese amphibious assaults. And the B-17s did attack some of the landing sites here in Subic Bay. Of course, in Subic Bay was the U.S. Asiatic Fleet. And it was near, as you see on this map, Manila. There's Subic Bay. The USS Houston was the flagship of that fleet. Only 5 destroyers and 27 submarines were in Manila Bay on December the 8th. The other cruisers and destroyers were scattered south of Manila, and all were on patrol with the Dutch Navy. Subic Bay and the naval installation was attacked and destroyed by the Japanese. 500 sailors and valuable torpedoes for the submarines were lost. On December 14th, the loss of air defense forced the Navy to move most of its units south. And of course, most of those units were destroyed in the Battle of the Java Sea, which was commanded by the Dutch. It was a scratch fleet of Australian, Dutch, and US and British ships, and it was destroyed, basically wiped out by the Japanese. They were trying to prevent the invasion of the Dutch East Indies. If you ever see the movie They Were Expendable with John Wayne, it covers that particular time period. So now the Japanese, on December 22nd, General Homa led 40,000 troops, landed near Luzon on the 24th. MacArthur had reached, on the 24th, they evacuated and retreated to the Bataan Peninsula. And on the 12th, MacArthur had been ordered to Australia. In fact, yesterday, March 17th, 81 years ago yesterday, MacArthur arrived in Australia to take command of the Southwest Pacific. So once again, did MacArthur know there was an attack coming? Yes. Did they order an attack on Formosa to try to wipe out the Japanese, at least part of the Japanese Air Force? Yes. It didn't work for the reasons I've outlined. Up until 1940, the strategy of the U.S. Navy and Army was, if the Japanese attacked the Philippines, the 7th Fleet with reinforcements would come to the Philippine Islands, all right? Wasn't going to happen. They changed their strategy in 1940 because they realized that that supply line would have been very tenuous and subject to tremendous attack by the Japanese Navy. No one was going to relieve the Philippines. The Filipino army was poorly trained and under-equipped. MacArthur did not have a viable defense plan to defend the Philippines with those forces. And the 20,000 men that we had in the Philippines were not sufficient to resist the massive numbers of Japanese that assaulted. On April the 9th, Bataan surrendered, and finally on May 6th, Corregidor surrendered as well. And here, of course, is General Wainwright surrendering to the Japanese. 3¼ years later, it's the same General Wainwright who on the deck of the battleship Missouri would sign the surrender papers of the Japanese that ended World War II for the United States. MacArthur, he had been in prison camp all of those years. As an interesting sidelight, I've read that he played thousands of games of solitaire during that time period. And he was a skeleton, basically, by the time he was released from prison. Well, of course, 70,000 Americans and Filipinos surrendered. And here's the Bataan Death March. 16,000 died in the Bataan Death March. So the defense of the Philippines was inadequate in scope and the forces deployed. The bottom line, the results was a disorganized mess because no one was geared for war. The United States was not prepared to defend the Philippines. There was no conspiracy. MacArthur did not hold something back, or they did not warn them of imminent attack. Now, meanwhile, across the whole Pacific, December 10th, Guam falls. December 11th to the 23rd, Wake Island, which initially resists valiantly, falls. December 26th, Hong Kong surrenders. And then comes the bicycle blitzkrieg, the fall of Singapore. Singapore, Malaysia, you see, is at the very tip of Malaysia, and was considered the Gibraltar of the East by the British. It was heavily fortified. It was thought impregnable for 3 reasons. First, huge naval guns would destroy the Japanese sea invasion. But a rearward assault through the Malayan jungles was thought impossible, can't be done. Just like the French said the Germans couldn't get through the Ardennes. Here are, and of course, there were 70,000 British and Commonwealth defense troops to defend Singapore, to make it impregnable. And the third piece, a huge naval base was built for the British fleet to come and defend Singapore. All of these factors were self-defeating. Why? Well, on December 8th, General Yamashita, who had just conquered the Philippines, was sent right after that to Malaysia. He landed 40,000 troops, but he attacked at the top of the Malaysian peninsula, not the bottom. There was no frontal assault. And the Japanese proved very adept at coming down that peninsula. In fact, their troops used bicycles, which we'll look in a minute. Secondly, there was no British fleet at Singapore. Where was it? It was in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. However, there was Force Z, which was the Prince of Wales, which was a modern battleship, the pride of the British Navy, and the Repulse, with destroyer escorts. And they were supposed to have the indomitable aircraft carrier with them to provide air cover. But it had been damaged, and it was being repaired. It was not available. On December the 10th, 1941, 85 Japanese land-based bombers and other aircraft attacked from Indochina. The ships were sunk. 1,300 survivors, 63 killed. This was the first instance in history where modern battleships that were underway, maneuvering with adequate anti-aircraft cover, were sunk by any Air Force. Now, the British did sink those battleships at Toronto, as I just mentioned to you, with torpedoes, but they were at anchor, just like our ships at Pearl Harbor. They weren't maneuvering. If the Indomitable had been there, that carrier, it would have been sunk as well, because the aircraft they had were obsolete aircraft. The Zeros would have shot them all down. At the time, Churchill stated, "In all the war, I had never received a more detestable shock." There were no Allied capital ships in the Southwest Pacific. British maritime invincibility was shattered. Morale sank, and any hope of victory in Singapore with it. In the meantime, the Japanese, there it is, the bicycle blitzkrieg, are coming down the peninsula, and they did it by landings. All right, they made multiple landings that outflanked all of the British attempts at defense. So it was a very rapid event. And they were able to maneuver around the British. The Japanese used their strategic superiority in the air and on the sea to completely render the British positions useless. Many of the British troops from India and elsewhere could not speak English, and there were inexperienced English officers to command them. There's Yamashita. And these poorly led troops, many surrendered throughout the entire campaign. Here's Purcell, commander of the Commonwealth Armed Forces. He was criticized for lack of aggressive leadership, not overcoming low morale, and trying to defend too much. However, in reality, the British position at Singapore was very weak from the very beginning, from the onset of this invasion. The impressive fortress's guns were useless. The Air Force was small and filled with obsolete aircraft. There was no Navy left. They had no tanks. They had little anti-aircraft. And they had no very poor communication between the different elements of their armed forces. On February 15th, 1942, 80,000 Allied prisoners of war fell into the hands of the Japanese, the largest surrender in the history of the British Empire, considering they were only opposed at that point by 60,000 Japanese, and the Japanese had only 2 more weeks of supplies before their supplies ran out. Of course, the British didn't know that. Yamashita accomplished with his 25th Army, they were outnumbered at times as much as 3-1. They had conquest of the entire 700-mile-long Malay Peninsula in 70 days. And they had torn through the impenetrable jungle, and they had overpowered the so-called Fortress of Singapore. Japanese casualties for the entire operation, 3,500. The Japanese had only 2 more days of supplies. 2 more days of supplies when the British surrendered. So the aftermath. January 19th, Burma surrenders. February 26th to the 27th, the Battle of the Java Sea, as I just mentioned, the ABDA command, Australian, British, Dutch, American combined fleet, 15 Allied warships sunk. March 1st, the Japanese invade Java. March 8th, the Dutch surrender. So, from December 7th to March 8th, 91 days, the Japanese conquered the entire Southwest Pacific. The Japanese established their so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. They reigned supreme across the Pacific. No Allied capital ships were present. The United States' lack of preparedness, not a conspiracy at the outbreak of the Second World War, caused these catastrophic defeats. You must remember, isolationism was very strong before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Even today, there are many people that say, we shouldn't support Ukraine. That has nothing to do with us. Let Russia conquer Ukraine. Let Russia take back Estonia, Latvia. Who cares about NATO? We went through that before, didn't we? Munich didn't stop Hitler. And our lack of preparedness certainly helped the Japanese to carve out this empire that thousands and thousands of young American men would have to die to win that war. Those of you who have heard me speak about the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. One of my early mentors at DePaul University, Dr. Joseph Lehman, was a sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps. He fought from Guadalcanal to Iwo. He was a British military historical expert. He never would talk about these battles. He said that he wouldn't go to hell because he had gone to hell on Iwo Jima. He had seen too many people destroyed. So, this idea of conspiracy is false. Now, we hope that never again the U.S. will be so unprepared for aggression. The British, after an era of appeasement in the 1930s, were equally unprepared to defend the Pacific, and they almost lost the Second World War, except for the fact they had the RAF and they had the Spitfire to defeat the German Luftwaffe in 1940, another program that I've given here. The final success of the Allied alliance in World War II must not let us ever again forget. Outside lurks the barbarians. Across the English Channel, a Napoleon or Hitler is always ready to invade. Today his name is Putin. So I hope that this has helped you to understand the facts of history. Historical facts are backed up by 3 independent sources. Sources that are expert, that are unbiased, who will tell you the same fact. That is historical. And I thank you very much for listening to this program. And next month is the giants, when giants ruled the sky, the story of the Zeppelins. American, German, British, Italian, Russian. And my wife Elaine and I had the opportunity to go to Friedrichshafen and see where they were built and get on a replica of the Hindenburg. And I've had the opportunity as well to go to Akron, Ohio, and stand inside of the gigantic air dome. You have one here between San Diego and LA. That was for the Los Angeles before it crashed. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you've enjoyed When Japan Strikes at Dawn.